30 minutes. That was all the time left before every asset, every ounce of my reputation and my deepest secret were liquidated into nothingness. When that gavel fell, I wouldn't just be broke, I'd be erased. The sweeping second hand of my Patek Philippe ticked against my wrist, heavy and unyielding, like the footsteps of a firing squad. 5:35 a.m. Inside the subterranean auction gala of the Metropole Hotel, the air was so thick it felt toxic. The cloying scent of expensive sandalwood drifted through the room, failing to mask the cold sweat of the men in bespoke Tom Ford suits. They sat in velvet chairs, leaning forward like vultures as waiting for a carcass to stop twitching. Beneath the suffocating glare of the crystal chandeliers, the auctioneer tapped his wooden gavel against the podium. "Moving on to Lot 09, his voice boomed through the speakers devoid of human emotion. The strategic portfolio of Nexus Core. This includes all controlling shares' proprietary infrastructure and the master source code encryption keys. We opened the bidding at $50 million. In my pocket, my phone buzzed against my thigh, a violent, rhythmic reminder of my collapsing world. 3 missed calls from my lead counsel. Then a text message flashed on the lock screen. 5 words that made the floor tilt beneath my feet. The hackers breached the drive. My heart hammered against my ribs, a stray bullet of adrenaline spiking through my veins. The master drive. It contained the proprietary algorithms that could prove my former partners had framed me for corporate espionage. It was supposed to be locked in a federal vault. Instead, through a web of corrupt judges and backroom handshakes, it had been seized, reclassified, and thrown onto the auction block under the generic label of liquidated tech assets. It was being sold to the highest bidder right in front of my eyes. 55 million? A voice called out from the front row. A sleek, manicured hand held up a silver paddle. It belonged to Marcus Vance, my former mentor. The man who had engineered my public downfall orchestrated the artificial freeze on my bank accounts and watched with a smile as the SEC dragged me out of my own building. Vance didn't look at the auctioneer. He slowly turned his head back toward me, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. He didn't just want the company. He wanted to own the knife that cut my throat. I clenched my fists so hard, my nails bit into my palms, drawing a thin line of blood. The hotel's industrial AC system was running at full blast, yet sweat beaded at my hairline, tracing a cold path down my jaw. I was completely cornered. My personal accounts were locked, my credit lines were severed. To the financial world, I was a ghost. 60 million, another voice echoed from the gallery. A proxy bidder for a European conglomerate. Vance didn't even blink. He raised his paddle again. 70 million. He was suffocating the market, burning through capital just to show he could. If Vance secured the drive, the encryption keys would be rewritten within seconds. The evidence of my innocence would vanish into a private server deleted forever, and I'd be facing a 20-year federal sentence with no way out. My mind spun into overdrive calculations, firing like miswired circuits. I had exactly 24 minutes left before the bank finalized the transfer of my remaining personal property. I needed a distraction. I needed to cut the power trigger a fire alarm, or buy myself enough time to get to the server room on the 4th floor and manually wipe the drive before it could be transferred. $70 million going once. The auctioneer intoned, his gaze scanning the room. The silence in the hall was deafening. Nobody was going to outbid Marcus Vance. The billionaires in the room knew better than to get between an apex predator and its prey. They were just here for the theatre. 70 million going twice. The auctioneer raised the wooden gavel high, the polished mahogany catching the sharp light of the chandelier. This was it. The absolute end of the line. I stood up. Every eye in the room pivoted toward the back row. The whispers started instantly, a low, rhythmic hiss of wealthy gossip. The disgraced golden boy, standing up at his own funeral. Vance's grin widened his eyes, mocking me, daring me to speak. 100 million, I said. My voice didn't shake. It cut through the room like a razor blade. The auctioneer paused his gavel, hovering inches from the block. Sir, your bidding credentials have been suspended pending the liquidation order. Check the ledger again, I replied, staring directly at Vance, whose smile had suddenly vanished. A new wire transfer cleared the Federal Reserve Clearinghouse precisely 3 minutes ago, sourced from a private trust in Zurich. I am fully liquid, and I am back in the room. It was a bluff. A beautiful, terrifying, catastrophic lie. There was no trust in Zurich. I had exactly 90 seconds before their compliance team checked the routing numbers and realized the transaction was a ghost script I'd coded from my phone while sitting in the back row. But 90 seconds was all I needed. Because as Vance opened his mouth to object, the overhead chandeliers flickered once, died, and plunged the entire underground ballroom into pitch-black chaos. The darkness that swallowed the subterranean ballroom of the Metropole Hotel was total, absolute, and suffocating. Emergency backup lights failed to kick in, muted by the precision spike I had initiated through the hotel's auxiliary mainframe. Instantly, the muted whispers of the American elite morphed into a raw, undisguised panic. Chairs scraped violently against the polished hardwood floor, crystal glasses shattered against tables, and the frantic, shrill ringtone of a dozen secure satellite phones filled the void. In the pitch black, I didn't lose a second. I had memorized the blueprint of the ballroom 3 nights prior, mapping every exit sign, every architectural pillar, and the exact distance from my back row seat to the service door on the western wall. Secure the exits. Don't let anyone leave. That was Marcus Vance's voice, raw and unpolished, stripped of its usual corporate elegance. He was shouting at his personal security detail, but his commands were drowned out by the rising tide of confusion. I slipped past a panicked proxy bidder from Chicago, ducked beneath a velvet rope, and slid through the heavy service door, before Vance's men could even orient themselves in the dark. The service hallway was illuminated by a faint, eerie green glow from the emergency exit signs. I sprinted down the narrow concrete corridor, the soles of my leather shoes slapping hard against the floor. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my mind had cleared entirely. The 90-second clock on my Ghostwire transfer had already expired. The compliance team in the ballroom would be tracking the fraudulent routing numbers right now. I had less than 10 minutes before the building was locked down by federal marshals and hotel security. I reached the service elevator, ripped the plastic cover off the maintenance panel, and jammed my bypass key, a custom-coded RFID cloner, into the slot. The heavy metal doors groaned open. I stepped inside and slammed my palm against the button for the 4th floor. The elevator climbed with agonizing slowness. Every inch of ascent felt like a year. I looked at my Patek Philippe. 10:51 a.m. The auctioneer's gavel had been suspended, but the moment the power grid was restored, Vance would legally claim the drive by default. I needed to destroy the physical architecture holding the source code before the network came back online. The elevator doors slid open into the minimalist, sterile corridor of the 4th floor server complex. The air here was ice cold, blasting from industrial vents to keep the data stacks from overheating. The floor was made of raised anti-static tiles, and the only sound was the deep, ominous drone of hundreds of cooling fans. At the end of the hall stood the heavy biometric glass door of server room 4B, and standing right in front of it was Bradley Vance Marcus's nephew and the newly appointed chief technical officer of Nexus Core, the man who had personally signed the fraudulent compliance reports that ruined my life. He was frantically typing on an encrypted military-grade laptop, his face illuminated by the harsh blue glare of the screen. "What the hell are you doing up here?" Bradley snapped his head, jerking up as he heard my footsteps. His hand dropped instinctively toward the internal radio clipped to his belt. The grid is downstairs. Did you do this? Move away from the console, Bradley, I said, walking toward him without breaking stride. My voice was dangerously calm, matching the freezing temperature of the corridor. You're done, Bradley sneered, stepping squarely in front of the glass door, his fingers tightening around his radio. Marcus is buying your entire life downstairs for pennies on the dollar. You're a felon. You don't belong in this building anymore. I built this building, I whispered. Before he could raise the radio to his mouth, I closed the distance. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed his collar, threw my weight forward, and slammed him hard against the reinforced glass door. The impact echoed through the hollow corridor. The radio clattered out of his hand, skittering across the anti-static tiles. Bradley gasped for air, his eyes widening in pure shock as I ripped the master security badge from his lanyard. I swiped his card against the biometric scanner and pressed his thumb firmly against the glass pane. The lock clicked a heavy mechanical thud that signaled the breach of server room 4B. I shoved Bradley to the floor, stepped over him, and entered the vault of my own stolen empire. Inside server room 4B, the rows of server racks loomed like monolithic black towers, their blue and green LED lights blinking in a chaotic, hypnotic rhythm. This was the beating heart of Nexus Core. Every line of code I had spent a decade writing, every proprietary algorithm that controlled the supply chains of half the Fortune 500 companies in the United States, lived on these drives. And nestled right in the center inside Stack 7 was the master drive they had dragged to the auction block. I ran to the main terminal at the end of the aisle. The system was running on a localized, uninterrupted power supply, completely independent of the hotel's main grid. Bradley's laptop was still tethered to the master port, a progress bar on the screen showing 94% completion. Data migration to Vance private servers. 6 minutes remaining. They weren't just buying the company, they were actively stripping it before the auction legally concluded. I smashed my fingers against the keyboard, overriding the admin protocols, using a hard-coded backdoor I had buried deep within the system architecture 5 years ago. A failsafe I prayed I would never have to use. The screen flickered, a red warning box flashing across the interface. Critical override detected. Enter master key. You can't stop it, Bradley shouted from the doorway, leaning heavily against the frame as he tried to regain his breath. The encryption is military grade. If you force a shutdown, the system will permanently lock, and the SEC will use that as proof that you destroyed evidence. Let them, I muttered. I didn't type a password. Instead, I pulled a heavy, solid-state electromagnetic pulse device, no bigger than a brick, out of my briefcase. I had spent my last $10,000 of unmonitored cash on the black market in South Boston to procure it. I slapped the magnetic base of the device directly onto the casing of Stack 07 right over the master drive. A heavy, synchronized set of footsteps echoed down the outside corridor. Security. Loud, authoritarian voices demanded an immediate surrender. Through the glass partition, I saw the silhouette of Marcus Vance himself. His tailored charcoal suit disheveled, his eyes wild with fury as his guards drew their weapons. "Break the glass," Marcus roared, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Shoot him if you have to protect that drive." The guards raised their batons and heavy tools, smashing them against the reinforced glass. Cracks splintered across the surface like a spider web, white lines racing across the transparent pane. One more hit, and they would be inside. Marcus glared at me through the fracturing glass, his face distorted by greed and rage. "You lose," he spat, his voice cutting through the broken barrier. "The migration is at 99%. It's over. I own you." I looked at my watch. 10:59 a.m. 1 minute before the official liquidation order would become irreversible. I looked Marcus dead in the eye, offering him the same cold, calculated smile he had given me when my world fell apart. In corporate litigation, Marcus, we call this a total liquidation, I said. I flipped the toggle switch on the black brick. There was no loud explosion, no dramatic flash of light. There was only a low, sub-audible hum that vibrated through the soles of my shoes, followed by a sharp metallic pop inside the server rack. Instantly, every single blinking LED light on Stack 07 went dead. The progress bar on the laptop screen froze, glitched and dissolved into a cascade of fatal system errors. The master drive was gone. The source code was fried. The algorithms that gave Nexus Core its multi-billion-dollar valuation were reduced to useless warped silicon. The glass door shattered completely, showering the floor with crystal shards as Marcus and his security team burst into the room. But they were too late. The room was dead silent, save for the whining sound of the cooling fans, spinning down to a permanent halt. Marcus ran to the console, frantically tapping the keys, but the screen remained stubbornly, mockingly black. He turned slowly to face me, his chest heaving, his hands shaking with an anger that transcended words. He had spent millions to destroy me, and in less than 3 minutes I had ensured that he bought nothing but an empty shell. I held up my hands, letting the security guards grab my wrists and slam me against the cold metal of the dead server rack. As the zip ties tightened around my skin, I leaned close to Marcus, whispering into the silence of his ruined investment. The asset has been liquidated. Call the press. The heavy, soundproofed walls of the Metropole Hotel's private security holding room were painted a sterile corporate beige, but no amount of neutral paint could mask the absolute fury radiating from Marcus Vance. The zip ties cutting into my wrists were tight enough to throb with every beat of my heart, pinning my arms behind a cold metal chair. 2 of Vance's personal security contractors stood by the door, their faces expressions of stone hands resting heavily on their tactical belts. Marcus paced the length of the room like a caged panther, his tailored Tom Ford jacket now draped over a chair, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar and stained with a thin ring of sweat. Every few seconds he would glance at his secure tablet, waiting for a miracle from his tech team that he knew deep down was never coming. You think you're a genius, don't you? Marcus finally stopped turning his gaze on me, his eyes dark with a venomous hatred. You just wiped out an asset valued at $450 million on the open market. You didn't just commit corporate sabotage up there, kid. You committed financial suicide. The SEC is going to bury you under a mountain of federal charges so high you'll never see the sun again. I leaned back in the chair despite the sharp pain in my shoulders and met his stare. The SEC cares about assets that exist, Marcus. As of 11 o'clock this morning, the Nexus Core source code is a fiction. You can't sue someone for destroying something that the compliance board hadn't even legally transferred to your balance sheet yet. I held the winning bid, Marcus roared, slamming his fist onto the laminate table. The noise echoed sharply in the small room. The auctioneer was at 2 counts when you initiated that little blackout stunt. Legally, that drive belonged to Vance International the second your fraudulent Zurich wire transfer failed compliance. Actually, it didn't, I said, letting a slow, deliberate calmness coat my words. Check the liquidation statutes for the Southern District of New York. In the event of a catastrophic infrastructure failure or a security breach during a federal liquidation auction, the entire lot is declared non-transferable until a full forensic audit can be conducted. The auction didn't conclude. It was invalidated. Marcus's phone buzzed on the table. He snatched it up, his knuckles turning white as he pressed it to his ear. "Tell me you found a backup," he demanded without greeting. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the tinny, panicked voice of Bradley Vance on the other end of the line. "The local mirrors are completely scrubbed, Uncle Marcus. The EMP didn't just fry Stack 07. It triggered an automated cascading wipe across our remote cloud servers. The system detected a hardware breach and executed the internal kill switch protocol. The code. It's gone. All of it. Asterisk? Marcus slowly lowered the phone, his face draining of what little colour it had left. He looked at me as if he were seeing a ghost. For 10 years, Shells, he had operated under the assumption that he could outmaneuver anyone with money and muscle. He hadn't realized that when I built the foundation of Nexus Core, I didn't just build a product, I built an arc, and I was the only one who held the key to the horizon. You ruined us both, Marcus whispered, his voice dropping into a ragged, desperate register. If the code is gone, the supply chain contracts with the logistics firms fail by Monday morning. The stock will plummet 70% at the opening bell. You didn't just beat me, you killed the company. I killed your version of the company. I corrected him, shifting my wrists to ease the pressure of the plastic bindings. The version built on insider trading, forged compliance reports, and the backroom betrayal of the man who gave you everything. But the architecture, the actual intelligence behind Nexus Core, that's not something you can destroy with a black market EMP. Marcus stepped closer, his shadow falling completely over me. What are you talking about? You really think I'd walk into a trap without a fallback plan? I asked. The drive I destroyed was the master repository, yes. But a master repository is just a mirror. The true source code, the polymorphic engine that generates the automation protocols, was never on that server. I offloaded it 3 weeks ago, long before your corrupt judges froze my assets. Marcus seized the lapels of my shirt, pulling me forward until I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. Where is it? It's currently sitting in an encrypted distributed ledger, slowly fragmenting across 1,000 anonymous nodes. I told him, looking directly into his panicked eyes. And there is only one person in the world who can reassemble the encryption keys before Monday's opening bell. The silence that followed stretched out for what felt like an eternity. Marcus's grip on my shirt slowly loosened, his hands trembling slightly as the full weight of the paradigm shift settled into his calculations. He was no longer the apex predator in the room. He was a man standing on the edge of a multi-billion-dollar abyss, and I was the only hand offering a rope. He turned to his security detail, his voice tight and controlled. Cut him loose and get out. The guards didn't hesitate. One of them stepped forward with a pair of tactical shears, snipping the heavy plastic zip ties in a single clean motion. I brought my arms forward, rubbing my bruised wrists to restore the circulation, watching Marcus as he walked back to the table and picked up his suit jacket, folding it neatly over his arm in an attempt to reclaim his shattered dignity. What do you want? Marcus asked, his tone stripped of all corporate theatrics. This was the raw, transactional language of Wall Street, the underbelly of American capitalism, where everything, even honor, had a price. I want my life back, Marcus, I said, standing up from the chair and stretching my back. First, you are going to sign a confession, a full, detailed, notarized admission of the corporate espionage and accounting fraud you used to frame me with the SEC. It will be delivered to the U.S. Attorney's Office within the hour. Marcus laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. I'll go to prison for that. You'll go to a minimum security facility for federal white-collar crime for 3 to 5 years, I countered. But if you don't sign it, the company collapses on Monday. Your investors will lose everything, the Department of Justice will hit you with racketeering charges, and you'll spend the rest of your natural life in a maximum security penitentiary. 3 years versus 30. You're a numbers man, Marcus. Do the math. He closed his eyes, his breathing heavy as he weighed the options. The empire he had spent a lifetime stealing was turning into dust in his hands, and his choices had narrowed down to a single agonizing bottleneck. Second, I continued, stepping toward the door. Vance International will forfeit all claims to the Nexus Core infrastructure. The liquidation order will be settled using the funds from an independent venture capital firm that I control through a proxy network. I buy back my company for the original $50 million opening bid, not a penny more. And the code? Marcus asked, his eyes opening, filled with a desperate residual greed. How do I know you'll actually restore the network? The moment the US attorney confirms receipt of your confession, and my proxy firm takes legal possession of the assets, the decryption algorithm will deploy automatically. I said, checking my Patek Philippe one last time. 11:15 a.m. The entire landscape of American tech logistics had been dismantled and rebuilt in exactly 30 minutes. The supply chains will remain intact. The investors will be protected. The only variable that changes is you. Marcus slumped against the table, the fight completely drained from his body. He looked down at his hands, then slowly nodded his head. "Get the paperwork," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "Get it done." I walked out of the holding room and stepped into the main corridor of the Metropole Hotel. The emergency lights had finally turned off, replaced by the warm gold illumination of the hotel's standard grid. The chaos in the ballroom below had subsided into a quiet, stunned confusion as the wealthy elite realized the auction was over. But the true story hadn't even broken yet. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a single unlisted number. It rang once before a calm, professional voice answered on the other end. "Is it clear? The asset is secure," I replied, looking out the panoramic glass windows at the sprawling skyline of New York City. The sun was breaking through the morning smog, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete jungle below. "Deploy the transition protocols. We are back in control." I hung up the phone and walked toward the elevators. The liquidation was complete, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one paying the price. The glass elevator of the Metropole Hotel descended smoothly, cutting through the architectural layers of the luxury high-rise until it dropped me into the grand lobby. Outside, the midday sun was hitting the pavement of Manhattan with a blinding, unforgiving glare. The crisp, clean air of the upper floors was instantly replaced by the raw energy of the New York streets. The roar of yellow cabs, the distant wail of a siren, and the restless hum of millions of people chasing the American dream or running from their nightmares. I stepped onto the sidewalk, turning my collar up against a sudden gust of wind, channeling down the avenue. My wrists still bore the faint red indentations of the plastic zip ties, a physical reminder of how close I had come to the edge. But as I walked past the reflective glass storefronts of Fifth Avenue, I didn't see a victim. I saw a ghost who had just learned how to haunt. My phone vibrated in my palm. It wasn't a call this time. It was a secure, encrypted data feed monitoring the US Attorney's portal for the Southern District of New York. Document upload in progress case. Ref number 992-Alpha. Marcus Vance's legal team was moving with the frantic speed of men trying to outrun an avalanche. The confession was being logged into the federal database. Within hours, the narrative that the mainstream financial media had spun for the last 6 months, the story of a brilliant young CEO who went rogue and embezzled millions from his own creation, would begin to fracture. The truth was a heavy, slow-moving object, but once it gained momentum, nothing on Wall Street could stop it. I ducked into a quiet, dimly lit diner 3 blocks away from the hotel. A rare relic of old New York, sandwiched between 2 towering glass monoliths. I took a seat in a worn leather booth at the back, away from the windows, and ordered a black coffee. I needed a moment where the world wasn't moving at the speed of a fiber optic cable. As the waitress set the ceramic mug down, a shadow fell over the table. "You look remarkably relaxed for a man who just committed a federal felony before lunch," a voice said. I didn't look up immediately. I took a sip of the bitter coffee, letting the heat settle my nerves before raising my eyes. Standing at the edge of the booth was Elena Vance Marcus's daughter and the former chief operating officer of Nexus Core. She wasn't wearing the corporate uniform of her family's empire. She was dressed in a dark trench coat, her sunglasses pushed up onto her head, her sharp eyes scanning my face for any sign of weakness. "The felony was a bluff, Eleanor," I said, gesturing to the empty seat opposite me. The restoration of the network, however, is very real. Sit down." She slid into the booth, her movements precise and calculated. She didn't touch the menu. Instead, she leaned forward, resting her intertwined fingers on the laminate tabletop. My father just called his personal crisis management firm. He sounded like a man who had just watched his own execution. "What did you do to him in that server room?" "I gave him a choice between a short sentence and a permanent grave," I replied flatly. "He chose the survival of his name. By Monday morning, my proxy firm Vanguard Meridian will hold the controlling interest in Nexus Core. Your father's shares are being liquidated to cover the structural damages he caused." Elena studied me for a long moment, her expression an unreadable mix of professional curiosity and familial betrayal. "He deserves it," she said softly, the words carrying a weight that surprised me. "He thought he could treat people like lines on a balance sheet. He forgot that the numbers only have power because of the architecture beneath them. But you're missing a critical piece of the puzzle." I paused the coffee mug halfway to my lips. "Am I?" "The SEC investigation wasn't just my father's doing," Elena said, leaning closer so her voice wouldn't carry over the low drone of the diner's jukebox. "He was the hand, yes. But the money that bought the compliance board, the offshore accounts that were used to simulate your embezzlement, that didn't come from Vance International's reserves. It came from a blind trust registered in Delaware, funded by a sovereign wealth group that wants Nexus Core dead." The air in the booth suddenly felt as cold as the server room on the 4th floor. I set the mug down, my mind immediately racing through the implications. "Who is the principal on the Delaware Trust?" Elena reached into her coat, pulled out a small, unbranded encrypted flash drive, and slid it across the table until it rested against the base of my coffee cup. "See for yourself. But do it quickly, because the moment that confession hits the public record, the people behind that trust aren't going to look for a legal remedy. They're going to look for a clean slate." The afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the concrete canyons of the financial district. By the time I reached the secure workspace I had rented under a shell name. The room was small, windowless, and stripped of any luxury. Just a steel desk, a secure satellite connection, and a custom-built workstation designed to operate entirely off the grid. I slotted Elena's flash drive into the isolated terminal. The interface flared to life, cascading lines of decrypted financial ledgers, filling the monitors with a cold green glow. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, dissecting the layers of shell companies' nesting trusts and offshore routing numbers that Eleanor had pulled from her father's private servers. It took me 40 minutes to break through the final layer of the Delaware Trust's encryption. When the true identity of the primary shareholder finally resolved on the screen, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a rival tech conglomerate. It wasn't a foreign sovereign fund. It was Julian Sterling, my co-founder. The man who had sat in a garage with me 10 years ago drinking cheap beer and writing the very first lines of code that would become Nexus Core. The man who had supposedly died in a private plane crash over the Atlantic 3 years ago. The tragedy that had shattered the company and allowed Marcus Vance to step in as the primary investor. "He's alive," I whispered to the empty room, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. The data on the screen was undeniable. The plane crash had been a masterclass in corporate disappearance. Julian hadn't died. He had cashed out his phantom shares through a series of European intermediaries, assumed a new identity within the global financial elite, and used Marcus Vance as a blunt instrument to systematically dismantle the company we had built together. But why Nexus Core was our legacy? It was the revolutionary automation matrix that was supposed to change how the world moved goods, how global trade functioned. Why spend 3 years and tens of millions of dollars to orchestrate its liquidation? I opened a secondary file on the drive labeled Project Kronos. As the architecture diagrams loaded, the terrifying truth began to assemble itself in my mind. Julian hadn't abandoned the code. He had evolved it. While I was focused on the commercial optimization of Nexus Core, Julian had taken a dark, unregulated version of our algorithm and turned it into a predictive financial weapon, a system capable of simulating market collapses seconds before they occurred, allowing whoever controlled it to short entire national economies with absolute certainty. Nexus Core wasn't being liquidated because it was failing. It was being liquidated because my commercial version contained the security protocols that could detect and block Julian's weaponized engine. As long as Nexus Core existed in its pure, secure form, his system couldn't operate on the global market without triggering a massive infrastructure alarm. I wasn't just a corporate rival to him. I was the only firewall standing between him and absolute economic dominance. A sudden, sharp chime cut through the silence of the room. It wasn't from the terminal. It was my personal phone, the unlisted number that only a handful of people in the world possessed. I picked it up, my hand steady, despite the adrenaline surging through my system. "Speak." A long pause stretched over the line, filled only with the faint rhythmic hiss of a high-grade encryption scramble. Then a voice spoke. A voice I hadn't heard in 3 years, unchanged calm and utterly devoid of remorse. "You always were too good at debugging character," Julian Sterling said, using the old nickname from our university days. I watched the feed from the Metropole. Smashing the drive with an EMP was a nice touch, very dramatic. But you're playing a game of checkers on a board, meant for global chess. "You faked your death, Julian," I said, my voice dropping into a hard, dangerous register as I stared at his name on the monitor. "You let me carry the weight of this company alone, and then you hired Vance to ruin my life." "Marcus was a necessary variable," Julian replied smoothly. "He had the ego, the connections, and the greed to draw your attention while I finalized the deployment. I needed you distracted, and I needed Nexus Core under a liquidation order, so the federal government would force the code into the public domain where I could absorb it legally. You ruined that timeline today." "I broke your machine," I told him. "You delayed it," Julian corrected me, a cold note of certainty in his tone. "The Monday morning opening bell is still coming, and Vanguard Meridian doesn't own the infrastructure yet. Look out the window, my friend." I stood up, stepping toward the small ventilation grate that looked out onto the narrow alleyway behind the building. In the dimming twilight, 2 black SUVs with tinted windows were idling quietly at the entrance of the alley. 4 men in dark tactical gear were stepping out their movements, silent, synchronized, and lethal. "You have exactly 2 minutes to give me the decryption keys to the polymorphic engine," Julian said, his voice echoing through the speaker of my phone. "Or the liquidation of your life becomes permanent." The countdown didn't appear on a screen this time. It played out in the synchronized, lethal movements of the men down in the alley. I dropped the phone onto the steel desk, leaving the line open. Julian's low, ambient breathing continued to hiss through the speaker, a digital ghost mocking me from across the world. I had exactly 90 seconds before those heavy tactical boots breached the building's lower security perimeter. I didn't waste time trying to pack up the heavy workstation. In my line of work, you don't save the machine, you save the data. I ripped the primary solid-state drive from its quick-release bay, throwing it into the inner pocket of my leather jacket, along with the unbranded flash drive Eleanor had given me. The room lacked a secondary exit. The window was a narrow ventilation grate, barely wide enough for a human fist, reinforced with iron rebar. That meant my only way out was down straight through the bottleneck the extraction team was currently sealing. The heavy thud of a hydraulic ram, striking the ground floor security door, echoed up the stairwell. The concrete structure of the old warehouse vibrated under the impact. 1 hit, 2 hits. On the third, the metallic screech of tearing bolts confirmed they were inside. I grabbed a heavy industrial canister of lithium-ion battery coolant from the workbench, yanked the safety ring, and wedged it beneath the door handle of my workspace. I wired a small lithium battery terminal to the pressurized valve, a crude but highly effective tripwire. The moment they forced the door, the localized chemical reaction would flood the small room with dense, blinding, toxic white smoke, destroying the residual hardware and covering my tracks. I stepped into the dark, narrow stairwell, just as the heavy, rhythmic thud of tactical boots began ascending the lower flights. They were moving in a standard two-man stack weapons, raised clearing corners, with the clinical precision of Black Ops contractors. I didn't go up to the roof. A rooftop was a dead end against a team with tactical supremacy and a perimeter grid. Instead, I dropped onto the metal railing of the third-floor landing and slid down into the shadow of the elevator shaft, dropping silently onto the grease-stained concrete of the second-floor service platform. Team 1, moving to the third floor, preparing to breach. A muffled voice echoed from the stairwell just above me. I slipped past the electrical distribution box and entered the vacant garment factory that occupied the second floor. Rows of abandoned sewing machines sat like skeletal remains under the dim twilight filtering through the dusty perimeter windows. Suddenly, a flashlight beam sliced through the darkness from the opposite side of the floor. A third operative had been stationed at the fire escape. He caught the movement of my jacket. "Contact second floor heading west." The guard barked into his throat mic. The sharp, suppressed thwip-thwip of a silenced submachine gun shattered the silence. Rows of old wooden sewing tables splintered into a cloud of sawdust and fabric fragments just inches behind my heels as I threw myself into a hard sprint. I didn't look back. I leapt over an overturned industrial cart, using the heavy metal base as the temporary cover, as another burst of gunfire chewed through the drywall above my head. The exit wasn't the fire escape. It was the old freight chute used for dropping heavy textile bundles directly into the delivery vans below. I kicked open the rusted iron hatch of the chute, gripped the edges, and dropped into the vertical darkness. The friction burned through the fabric of my jeans and jacket as I shot down the steep metal incline, launching out of the lower opening and slamming hard onto the canvas roof of a garbage dumpster in the side alley. The impact knocked the wind clean out of my lungs, a sharp spike of pain radiating through my ribs. I rolled off the canvas, hitting the wet asphalt, just as the backup SUV at the mouth of the alley began to reverse violently toward my position, its tires screeching against the pavement. The headlights blinded me for a fraction of a second. I scrambled to my feet, diving behind a row of heavy iron grease vats belonging to the commercial kitchen next door. The SUV slammed into the dumpster with a deafening crunch of metal and plastic pinning my escape route shut. From the top of the stairwell inside the building, a sudden muffled explosion rattled the windows. My chemical tripwire had just detonated, blowing a thick cloud of white lithium smoke through the upper floor. The driver of the SUV hesitated, his attention momentarily fractured by the explosion above. That split second was all I needed. I sprinted out of the blind spot of the alley, throwing myself into the crowded, chaotic flow of the lower Manhattan evening rush hour, just as the first tactical team members emerged onto the street, their weapons hidden beneath long coats, their eyes scanning the sea of anonymous faces. But in New York, once you hit the crowd, you vanish. By 7:30 a.m. on Monday, the rain was coming down in sheets, turning the flashing neon billboards of Times Square into a blurry, distorted kaleidoscope of corporate advertising. The financial world was waking up to a historic crisis. Every major news network was running the same banner across the bottom of the screen. Vance International plunges into receivership. SEC investigates accusations of systemic fraud. I sat in a high-backed leather chair inside the private conference room of Vanguard Meridian, located on the 42nd floor of a sleek tower overlooking the New York Stock Exchange. My ribs were taped tightly beneath a fresh charcoal grey suit, and my Patek Philippe had been replaced by a rugged, unbranded tactical watch. Across the glass table sat Elena Vance. She looked exhausted, her eyes rimmed with red, but her posture remained ironclad. Beside her was a team of 6 senior securities lawyers I had retained, using the last remaining untainted capital reserves from my Swiss accounts. "The U.S. attorney finalized the injunction at 6 a.m., Elena said, sliding a certified federal order across the table. My father's voting shares have been legally frozen and transferred to the custody of the bankruptcy court. Vance International cannot block the acquisition. At the opening bell, Vanguard Meridian's tender offer becomes the only valid bid on the table. And Julian's Delaware Trust, I asked, looking at the real-time trading terminals lining the wall. They're shorting the entire logistics sector, one of the attorneys interrupted, pointing at a cascading waterfall of red numbers on the monitor. Look at the volume. Someone is dumping billions of dollars into highly leveraged put options against every major shipping and transport firm in North America. They aren't just betting on Nexus Core failing, they're triggering a systemic collapse. Julian wasn't waiting for the auction anymore. He was using his weaponized predictive engine Project Kronos to force the market into an artificial panic, capitalizing on the temporary infrastructure blackout I had caused on Saturday. If the transport networks didn't come back online within the next 15 minutes, the automated trading algorithms used by every major bank on Wall Street would trigger a massive automated sell-off. The damage would be irreversible. "We have 9 minutes before the opening bell," Elena whispered. Her eyes locked on me. "Do you have the decryption keys?" I pulled the solid-state drive from my briefcase and slotted it into the conference room's central media hub. The screen on the wall flickered to life, showing the fragmented, dormant architecture of the Nexus Core polymorphic engine. It was a digital engine of immense power, waiting for its spark. I opened the terminal interface and began typing the reassembly sequence. But as the final code blocks began to align, a prompt appeared on the center screen, overriding my inputs. Incoming transmission broadcast source encrypted peer-to-peer. The face of Julian Sterling appeared on the high-definition monitor. He was sitting in a sunlit minimalist office somewhere in a European time zone, a glass of mineral water resting beside his laptop. He looked perfectly calm, a man watching a predictable piece of theatre play out exactly as he had written it. "Good morning, character," Julian said, his voice echoing flawlessly through the conference room's premium speaker system. "I see you survived the alleyway. I always admired your physical resilience. But look at the board. You're too late." "The federal court froze Vance's assets, Julian," I said, leaning forward into the camera mounted above the screen. "Vanguard Meridian buys the infrastructure in exactly 7 minutes. Your proxy acquisition failed." Julian let out a soft, melodic laugh. "You still think this is about ownership? I don't need to own Nexus Core, my friend. The moment the bell rings and your pristine, secure version of the code fails to initialize the shipping grids, the market panic will hit the threshold. My Kronos engine has already pre-sold $80 billion in transport equities. Whether you deploy your keys or not, the collapse is mathematically locked in. Not if the grid initializes before the automated sell-offs trigger." I said, my fingers hovering over the enter key on my laptop. "The second you hit that button, your deployment protocol has to pass through the central clearinghouse servers in New Jersey," Julian replied, his smile widening into something cold and predatory. "And who do you think wrote the routing firmware for those clearinghouse servers? 5 years ago, I built a hidden latency loop into that infrastructure, Julian. Your code will take exactly 12 minutes to propagate. By then, the market will have dropped 10,000 points. The wealth transition will be complete." The lawyers in the room went deathly pale. Elena stood up, her eyes wide as she looked at the real-time clock ticking down on the terminal 9:26:45 a.m. Julian had rigged the actual pipes of the American financial system. It was a structural ambush, and I had walked right into the center of the kill zone. "You built the pipes, Julian," I said, my voice dropping into a steady, resonant frequency that filled the room. "But you forgot who taught you how to solder the joints." I didn't hit the enter key. Instead, I reached down and executed a secondary command script I had spent the last 24 hours compiling inside my secure workspace. "I didn't route the deployment through New Jersey," I told him, looking directly into his fading smile. I just spent 48 hours converting the polymorphic engine into a decentralized peer-to-peer network. The code isn't traveling through the clearinghouse servers. It's deploying simultaneously through the edge routers of every single delivery truck cargo ship and automated warehouse drone already running our legacy firmware. We aren't asking the system for permission, Julian. We are the system. Julian's face froze on the screen. He turned frantically toward a secondary monitor off camera, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he realized the horizontal nature of the attack. On our wall, the countdown hit 0. The loud, historic clanging of the opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange echoed through the streets below. Instantly, the red waterfall on the trading monitors stalled. A massive green spike of infrastructure initialization data surged across the grid as millions of devices across the United States woke up simultaneously, completely stabilized by the decentralized Nexus Core engine. The Kronos engine's predictive loop shattered, caught in a massive liquidity trap of its own making, as transport stocks skyrocketed within the first 30 seconds of trading. Julian turned back to the camera, his composure entirely gone, his face a mask of ruined ambition. "You just liquidated $80 billion of short capital," he hissed, his voice trembling. "You've ruined me." "The asset has been restored, Julian," I said, reaching over and slamming the laptop lid shut, cutting his feed forever. I turned to Eleanor and the stunned room of attorneys, taking a deep breath as my taped ribs protested the movement. "Get the legal team to the SEC. Let's go pick up our company." The morning rush hour on Wall Street was a blur of black umbrellas and wet asphalt. But inside the boardroom of Vanguard Meridian, the air was deadly still. The trading terminals on the wall were no longer flashing the chaotic red of a systemic collapse. Instead, they settled into a steady, rhythmic green. The decentralized deployment had worked. By bypassing the corrupted New Jersey clearinghouse, the Nexus Core network had stabilized the shipping grids of 48 major logistics corporations in less than 60 seconds. Julian Sterling's $80 billion short position wasn't just beaten, it was completely incinerated. In the ruthless logic of the market, a short position requires the asset to fail. When the asset instead roared back to life with a decentralized vengeance, the automated margin calls triggered instantly. Julian's capital was being pulled into the market machine, liquidated to pay the very firms he had tried to destroy. Elena Vance stood by the glass windows, watching the ticker on the screen below. Vanguard Meridian now holds 51% of the voting shares of Nexus Core, she said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of a 3-day war. The SEC has officially suspended the liquidation order. The company is legally ours. Not yet, I replied, standing up from the conference table. My ribs ached with every breath, but the adrenaline kept the pain at bay. We own the shell and we own the infrastructure. But as long as Julian is breathing down a secure satellite link from a non-extradition jurisdiction, he is a threat. A man who loses $80 billion doesn't go quietly into the night. He burns the house down on his way out. I turned back to my terminal. The flash drive Elena had given me was still slotted into the machine, its deep-level financial forensic data still processing in the background. While the market was stabilizing, my automated scraping scripts had been tracing the origin of the capital Julian used to back his weaponized Kronos engine. "Look at the screen," I said, gesturing to the lead attorney. The green lines of financial code had shifted into a complex, multi-dimensional map of shell companies. But at the apex of the pyramid, the final destination of the liquidated funds wasn't Julian's personal accounts. It was a sovereign wealth fund registered under a generic diplomatic registry in Geneva, Switzerland. "He wasn't acting alone," Eleanor whispered, stepping closer to the monitors. Julian didn't have $80 billion of his own liquidity, even with his phantom shares. Someone else financed the weapon. The sovereign fund belongs to a global logistics cartel based out of Western Europe. I explained my fingers typing the final decryption sequence to lock down the source data. They didn't want to destroy Nexus Core because they hated the technology. They wanted to destroy it because our automation matrix makes it impossible for them to control international shipping lanes through bribery and artificial scarcity. Julian was just their architect. He built the execution dock, and they supplied the electricity. The boardroom doors opened, and a young associate rushed in, holding a tablet with a live feed from the federal courthouse downtown. The U.S. attorney just held a press conference. Marcus Vance's confession has been fully verified. The grand jury is issuing indictments for corporate espionage, wire fraud, and conspiracy against the entire executive board of Vance International. Elena didn't blink. She simply nodded. She had made her choice 48 hours ago. In that diner, she had traded her father's empire to save her own soul and the integrity of the technology we had built. "What's our next move?" she asked, looking at me. The hierarchy in the room had completely shifted. I was no longer the disgraced founder begging for his life in a hotel holding room. I was the chief architect of the new global infrastructure. "We deliver the final blow," I said. I opened a secure, encrypted uplink to the Swiss Financial Markets Supervisory Authority, FINMA, and the compliance division of the International Monetary Fund. I didn't send them a legal brief. I sent them the raw, unedited master ledger of Project Kronos, along with the digital signatures tying the Geneva Sovereign Fund directly to the state-sponsored cyber attack on Saturday morning. In the world of high finance, you can buy judges, you can bribe politicians, and you can manipulate the SEC. But the one thing you cannot do is threaten the stability of the global currency reserve. By weaponizing a predictive market engine against the entire American transportation sector, Julian's backers hadn't just committed a crime, they had declared economic warfare. The moment this data hits the international clearing network, the Swiss authorities will freeze the sovereign fund's assets under anti-terrorism financing statutes. I told the room. Julian's safety net is gone. The people who financed his lifestyle will turn on him within the hour to protect their own diplomatic immunity. As if on cue, my personal phone buzzed on the table. The screen showed a blocked number routing through a proxy server in Zurich. I picked it up and pressed it to my ear, but I didn't say a word. I wanted him to speak first. I wanted to hear the sound of a man who realized the walls had finally closed in. The silence on the other end lasted for 5 long seconds. When Julian finally spoke, the smooth, arrogant confidence from before was entirely gone. His voice sounded thin, dry, and hollow. "You didn't just protect the company character," Julian whispered. "You broke the system. They're freezing the accounts. My security detail just left the compound in Munich. They took the servers with them." "You built a weapon that relied on the world being predictable, Julian," I said, looking out at the rain-soaked skyline of Manhattan. "But human beings aren't predictable, and neither am I."